Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Greetings and welcome to Mortification of Spin. I'm your host, Carl Trueman. I teach at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania, where it is currently snowing at the end of April. I'm here, as always, with my long-standing friend, my only friend, my pal, Todd Pruitt, who is pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg in the great state of Virginia. It is a state, not a commonwealth. Is that right?
It is a
Todd?
state, although every once in a while, when we're feeling a little arrogant, we'll refer to ourselves as the Commonwealth.
The Commonwealth. We're a commonwealth in Pennsylvania, of course. It's great to be here. Todd, of course.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah,
Todd is a pastor in the PCA, so he's beginning to get that annual depression as he moves towards the General Assembly.
As General Assembly's coming up, just kind of wondering.
Craziness will happen. And what can one say? The PCA is not far from the kingdom of God. It's not the OPC.
Exactly.
It's not far from the kingdom of God.
Yeah. One of the things you told me years ago, Carl, was that as I was lamenting some of the goofiness that goes on in the PCA from time to time, you said, well, listen, we have crazy people in the OPC, but I just prefer our crazy people to your crazy people. So I suppose maybe I'm there too. So
there's something to be said for craziness you can understand as opposed to craziness you can't understand. Yeah. My wife and I were in Providence, Rhode Island last weekend. I was speaking at Providence College on Saturday at their Veritas conference on friendship, and we were staying in a hotel with Rusty Reno from First Things and Fran Mayer, friend from First Things, and there was some kind of kink drag queen conference on in town, and they were staying at our hotel. That's so craziness I can't understand.
I'm so glad that happened to you.
It reminded me of that time you took Karen away for the romantic weekend and found yourself in the middle of the furry convention.
Yes, Washington, D.C.
saying, I'm standing with my wife in an elevator next to an elk.
I pull into the parking lot of our hotel in Washington, D.C., and all of a sudden, at first I think, what are the, is it college game day somewhere? Because I'm looking at what I think are mascots until I realize, oh no, I've read about these people, and they were by the hundreds, walking all around, and so I had to immediately start texting you pictures because I thought Carl will enjoy this.
Well, I had to say, your suffering and disappointment brought me endless entertainment that day.
Well, and
I laughed and laughed at each picture. But anyway. We have a guest today.
Talking
of craziness that I do understand, we have a friend today from the Southern Baptist Convention. It's always good to interview a man who I think is balder than I am. It is a good friend of ours, repeat guest on the show, and a rising voice among Protestants making the case for natural law ethics. I've said repeatedly in class and on this show that one of the big needs in Protestantism at the moment is deeper, more profound reflection upon ethics, because the big challenges in some ways we're facing in our churches today are not the traditional challenges of denial of the resurrection, scriptural authority. Those are pretty easy to spot and in some ways relatively straightforward to answer. Many of the questions pressing on us today are questions connecting to ethics and morality, whether we're talking fertility treatments, sexuality. The big questions a lot of pastors are facing are not theological directly, they're ethical. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce my friend, Professor Andrew Walker. Andrew is Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He's also one of the kingpins at World Opinions, where I myself write a column a couple of times a year. He's formerly, I think, Andrew, am I right in saying, of the Heritage Foundation in DC?
Formerly, yeah.
And he's editor of a new book Social Conservatism for the Common Good, a Protestant Engagement with Robert P. George. Foreword by Ben Sass.
Mm-hmm.
The authors, as I look at the list of authors, which include, modesty, I have to say this, I'm in there.
They're in the book, yeah, absolutely.
It's like a list of the few friends I have on the face of the planet. It's a great book from that perspective. And Andrew and I are both privileged to count Robbie George, not only, I would say, as a friend, which is a privilege in itself, but also as a mentor.
Yeah.
Somebody who shaped the way we think. Now, Robbie is a devout Roman Catholic, but he has had a profound effect on a rising generation of Protestant thinkers. And this book is a reflection of that. This book is exclusively Protestant in terms of those who write it, except for the contributions of Professor George itself, and a testimony to how Robbie's thought and indeed his personality or approach or ethos is shaping the way the church in general and even the Protestant church think about these things. So, Andrew, great to have you on the program.
No, hey, great to be with you both. And I have to say here two things. Carl is a dear friend of mine. Todd, I hope to become better friends with you. But I also did notice that the segue to introduce me was drag queens and furries. So
Yeah.
I don't know what that's revealing about how you think of me, Carl. But you know, it's on brand given the stuff that I write about.
Well,
so,
I would just say that those two subjects are just frequent topics of discussion for Carl and I. So, I mean, at any given moment, it's likely we're going to be talking about drag queens and furries. And so, I mean,
don't worry, I do too all the time, so it's okay.
So, Andrew, it's I mean, I was honored to be invited to contribute to the book. I gather from chatting to Robbie and from the reports I've had from you that Robbie himself considers it one of the few books where the people who actually understand what he's saying have written about him. What gave you the idea to do this? I think it's a great idea. Kudos to Crossway for publishing it. What gave you the idea?
So, I mean, I have to go back to the genesis of kind of where I began with my introduction to Robbie George. And that is what I think was around 2007. I came across this book of his called A Clash of Orthodoxies. And honestly, I don't know how I came across the book, but I did. I began reading it. And I was this evangelical kid at the time. I would have been probably 20 or 21 and reading incredibly powerful arguments that completely aligned with my Christian worldview. But these weren't arguments that had Bible verses attached at the end of the sentences. And so obviously, you know, in hindsight, I was learning how to argue from the natural law tradition of what, you know, Robbie obviously does. But when you're, you know, a teenage kid growing up in evangelical circles, you know, this is where big intellectual ideas begin to have consequence, where, you know, the natural law tradition was basically lost in Protestant circles for a good chunk of the 20th century. And so I'm bearing witness to that fact. But I come across this book in 2007 and I'm blown away at what I'm reading. That begins kind of following who this figure is in articles that he had been writing. And then in 2009, this profile of him comes out in the New York Times called The Conservative Christian Big Thinker. And the New York Times, I'll never forget, they refer to him as like the greatest living social conservative thinker alive. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's a significant statement. And I think that even kind of catapulted me into more interest because we all have our interests intellectually. My intellectual interests would be related to those categories of social conservatism. And so I was immediately drawn more and more into the work of Robbie George. And then, you know, getting into his kind of broader intellectual relational network with friends like Ryan Anderson, who Carl and I work with at EPPC. And it kind of spiraled or snowballed from there. But the genesis of the book itself really began in December of 19, when I was sitting in my office at Southern Seminary, and I noticed on one of my bookshelves, I had like a whole row of books just by Robbie George. And I just was thinking to myself, you know, of living thinkers, there are, you know, several that have profoundly impacted me. But I just admittedly, he's the first amongst equals of those that have impacted my own worldview. And I thought, I think that his work needs to be translated even more than it already was to an evangelical audience. And in Protestant intellectual circles, Robbie George is a known commodity. Mm-hmm. But if you begin to think about who Robbie George is, if he's known by evangelical lay people, he's not. And so as Carl mentioned, I think the need of the hour are these moral issues, these public theological issues. And so I thought, what would it look like to synthesize his work into one volume that would be both a festschrift, so we are trying to honor him, but it is more than your traditional festschrift. I really am trying to make a dent in kind of the evangelical intellectual landscape with showing the relevance and profoundness of his work for Protestant evangelicals as we think more about these issues of social ethics, and particularly on those issues where it's the most controversial: life, definition of male and female, issues of marriage. And so I just thought, man, this has to be done. And, I'm 38 and I still have a long career ahead of me, but I can tell you already, this is one of the works I'm most proud of in my career so far, that I think could actually have some staying power that shows maybe in 30 to 50 years from now, this book is looked back on as kind of an intellectual revolution or intellectual awakening for Protestants, kind of coming of age, so to speak, in how we engage these issues.
Yeah, those issues you talk about, they are pressing pastoral issues. These are not abstract political things. Anybody who teaches in a college or anybody who is a pastor of a church is confronted with questions about fertility, sexuality, gender on a regular basis.
Yeah. Well, and we joke about like the drag queen story hour stuff, and it is absurd and ridiculous. But like, in this discussion in kind of a First Amendment situation like America, we have these conversations around goods, moral goods, and constitutional rights, and we have to figure out how to when do rights yield to certain goods and goods yield to certain rights. And Robbie's framework is actually super helpful, that I think we should embrace more of, and say that there are actual moments where no matter how much you like your free speech and your freedom of assembly, if there are demonstrable moral harms, we have to be able to demonstrate what those are in kind of the language of the lingua franca, right? Like, it's never less than scriptural, but you have to be able to explain in a public forum why men dressed up as women is actually dangerous to the common good. And that assumes that there may be people in that conversation who don't believe in scripture. But, as the natural law tradition teaches, that we do have some moral consensus, some moral common denominator. And I think that's why Robbie's work is very helpful on that front.
Two peculiar things always stand out to me about Robert George. And one is the fact that he is not nearly as angry and pessimistic as I think he ought to be. And then the other thing is that why in the world has he not been chased out of Princeton yet? In all seriousness, as I think about other people, I mean, it's not a secret. He makes no secret about where he stands on these issues. He's extremely articulate and has been for years. Yeah. I'm amazed that he's been able to find a home, at Princeton.
I think that's definitely the glories of tenure.
Yes.
I think that's the fact that, in intellectual and public intellectual life in America, he's definitely one of the most famous public intellectuals. If you go after Robbie George, you're going to pay, I think, some social cost, even if you're Princeton, with getting media attention. But I also think that if Robbie were here, I think he would tell you that after he retires, there probably is a glass ceiling over future Robbie Georges getting hired. Yeah. And, I don't want to give names or institutions, but there are people in the Robbie George network who are absolutely brilliant, who are much younger than him, who I think, and they would say, have had glass ceilings placed over their heads because, and I'm talking at our most elite institutions in America, and they would tell you that they might have been finalist for positions as candidates, but they didn't get the position. And they think that, well, it's because we're known as stalwart social conservatives because we've been birthed out of the Robbie George network. So I think we do have to have some realpolitik to know. That I think that the chances of there being another Robbie George at Princeton are few. But I think if his public charisma teaches us anything, it's that you keep making the arguments regardless of what the consequences are, and you let the cards fall as they do.
Yeah.
I was very struck in my year at Princeton. The Madison Fellows would get together once a week for coffee and donuts. And most weeks something crazy had happened somewhere. There was some loony progressive policy being pushed either at Princeton or somewhere else in the country. And I was very struck at, Robbie would come in and would say, okay, this has happened. And his response was not, okay, let's throw bricks through windows and get really annoyed about this. His response was this: so how are we going to respond? Yeah. What are we going to do that is a creative and persuasive response to this thing? And although you were saying before the show that he considers me to be far too pessimistic, he should meet some of my pals. But I think I am less pessimistic than I was before I met him. He certainly has that effect, and he is like I think our friend Ryan Anderson. I think I've seen Ryan described as the most cheerful culture warrior there is.
Yeah,
these are not men marked by anger and bitterness. They're men marked by a cheerful humanity, a humanitarianism that shapes how not simply what they say, but how they say it.
Well, and that gets into one of the reasons I wanted to do the book that I did was that you can't separate the effectiveness of Robbie George as a thinker from Robbie George, both the institution builder, but then also Robbie George in terms of his character and his demeanor. And I don't want to use the stupid word winsome because that's been overused and it means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. But one of the things you notice about Robbie George is that he's indefatigably cheerful, and he has to be reckoned with intellectually. And so people may be aghast at the positions that he holds, but he has to be taken seriously at an intellectual level. And people might dislike him personally even, but I would not want to square off with him in a formal debate simply because of both the prowess of his intellect and the fact that he's incredibly charming and winsome. I just said the dreaded word as I tried to censor myself. But this gets to the fact that there are, before you have the intellectual arguments, there have to be almost intellectual virtues that surround the conversation. Are you a disagreeable person? Are you able to entertain competing worldviews and understand them and not be fragile? And so I think in many ways, fragility is just the currency of our day. And in many ways, he represents both a joyful anti-fragility. And I think we need more of that.
Yeah. So thinking more broadly about social conservatism, I'm old enough to remember, I think I was in 8th grade, the 1980 presidential election where Ronaldus Maximus Reaganus was ascended the throne, and there was much rejoicing in my home among my parents. I remember it well, but I also remember that as divided as things were in the nation at that time, doesn't hold a candle to how we're divided now. And the other thing is that I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that as divided as we were, I think one of the reasons why it was not as maybe violent and vitriolic at that time is that so much of the debates politically had to do with things like economic policy and taxation, things that, we can have serious disagreements on for sure, but where we would also sort of instinctively understand that even Christians of good conscience can disagree on some of those kinds of issues. And so the vitriol oftentimes only reached a certain level, because very often we knew we weren't in some of those debates talking about good versus evil. We were generally talking about, a good idea versus a bad idea, or that type of thing. That's changed a lot now, where when we're talking about things like abortion, and abortion was a big issue in 1980, but it became an increasingly bigger issue as time went on. But, I can't think of a single Democrat in 1980 who would have hung out a flag publicly, prominently on the LGBTQ issue. And so now I think a lot of us on the social conservative side are saying, the nature of the debate has changed because the things that we're debating has changed so much.
Yeah, no. So, amen to everything you just said. I'm not sure if you saw clips of this going around social media, but Tucker Carlson gave this speech at the Heritage Foundation Gala. And regardless of whatever you think of Tucker Carlson, I know that he says some things that are not always defensible, but he gave an incredible speech, and he was making this same exact point. We're no longer debating tax policy, right? Yeah. We're debating what is created reality itself. And one of the things that I'm constantly teaching to my students is, if you look at American society today, and this ought to be a vindication for the relevance of social conservatism, but if you look at American society today, like, we are so unhealthy as far as our suicidal ideation. We're not marrying, between abortion, between not being able to define what is a male and a female. And of course, our society is going through a death rattle of sorts in this moment. And I think what we're seeing here is, if you look at Genesis 1 and 2, kind of the lineaments of creation order, what do you have? You have at least three categories I can think of. You have the necessity of life. You have the necessity of male and female being static, concrete identities. And then you have the presence of marriage. And I think from marriage, culture formation. And what has our culture done right now? Well, we have abortion, we have transgenderism, we have gay marriage. And what do we see as a result of that? A failure to launch at a cultural productivity level, as far as our people just being utterly miserable, and that our society is not giving us or affording us the abilities to attach to the necessary institutions for us to thrive. If we're telling people that your life is dispensable, if we're telling young children, chop off body parts if you want, and then we're telling people, use your body parts in whatever outlet you want to put your body parts, and delay or throw off the order of marriage. I mean, it's no shock and surprise of the disarray that we're in. And so, I am confronted with, these news stories about how Gen Z is more socially progressive, and we're all dead if you're a social conservative, demographically, so to speak. And I just don't care, quite frankly, because if truth is truth, truth must be witnessed to regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the consequences. And I tell all my students that, everyone wants to change the world, right? That's the moniker of our age. Get out and do something, change the world. Literally, the best way you can do that right now is to defend those pillars from creation order in Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
So far from these being issues that we should run from and be afraid of, you should run toward them and proudly defend them. And I think, again, that's one of the reasons I think that the book that I've done here is important, is it's providing that intellectual seedbed to help Protestants think critically about those issues, and to arm us with the tools necessary to engage the world around those topics.
Yeah, Andrew, our famous friend Carl Trueman has some well-known books, and I wasn't gonna say this in front of Carl because it's only going to make him feel really good about himself. But
go on, say it, please. Come on.
But I'm teaching a Sunday school.
Day.
Yeah, I'm teaching a Sunday school class right now, and we're using the curriculum that Crossway produced for Carl, your book, Strange New World, and have about 200 adults in that Sunday school class. And one of the things, we just finished chapter 7 this last week. Every single week so far in the discussion time, we come back to the first 2 chapters of Genesis. We go back to the first 2 chapters of Genesis, and we go to Romans chapter 2 in terms of God writing his law upon the consciences, even of the Gentiles, even of those without the law. And part of the point I make each week is precisely the point you made. We keep speaking the truth, in one, because it's truth and you should speak it, win, lose, or whatever. The other thing, though, is that we have to remember, and I say this as an encouragement to these folks each week, is that the people you're talking to have the law of God written on their heart, and they have a God-haunted conscience. And so when you speak the truth to them, and particularly when you're competent in doing that, God can use that to irritate that conscience, to agitate their conscience in the best way. And so because, and this goes back to natural law. These are things we can't not know.
Yeah.
We can't not know about what homosexuality does to the body, about transgenderism, about abortion, these kinds of things. And so we speak the truth, not only because it's the truth, but because also God has made the truth powerful.
And I'm not the person who's coined this term. I think it was Francis Schaeffer, but this notion of borrowed capital, that the world relies upon kind of the Christian moral ecosystem, even though if it wants to reject Christianity. And I find myself just going back to this argument over and over and over again. And I was just recently reacquainted with this exchange with Tom Holland, who's the skeptical agnostic. He might be an atheist, but British historian. And he gets asked, how should Christians relate in this kind of post-Christian secularizing culture? And it's a weird question to ask a secularist. And he gives an incredible answer. And he says, well, one of the things that I would stress if I were a Christian is that you don't get Western civilization, the things that we take for granted, like rights, forgiveness, rule of law, apart from the Christian moral ecosystem. That's and then he literally goes on to say this, and I could not believe this. He says, it takes just as much faith to believe in human rights as it does the resurrection.
Right.
And so you've got this secular guy making that statement, and you're like, oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
So if you're going to like human rights, why not try out the resurrection as well? And then the Christian worldview comes along and says, well, these are not just disjointed realities. They're all uniformly united under this idea of God's goodness, God's sovereignty. And so again, I think these are as society frays more and more at the margins. This is where I think we have more of an opportunity. And to Carl's points, we may go down with the ship, but we should go down with the ship trying at least, right? And while trying to exhibit, I think, the necessary intellectual virtues in doing so. And so these are hard times, no doubt about it. They're also exciting times for Christians to have to figure out, like, what does it mean to bear witness in a society that is losing all pretense in many ways, trying to be Christian. And so I just hope that this book is one meager contribution to the conversation. And in fact, I think since the last time I was on this podcast, I've got another book off to the publisher it's called Faithful Reason, Natural Law Ethics for God's Glory and Our Good. So I'm trying to continue down this stream of producing materials that can help Christians understand not only the truthfulness of our worldview, but the profound goodness that inheres within it as well.
Yeah, one of the things that Carl and I have talked about in the past is just how these current days have pressed Protestants into catching up on the whole issue of natural law, remembering our heritage there. I mean, we're heirs of the early church fathers. We need a doctrine of the body. We need a good understanding of the place of natural law. And these days have been pressing us into doing that. And And that's a good thing. And it's interesting, you mentioned Tom Holland. I heard Tom Holland give just this great, and maybe we're talking about the same talk, but where he talked about human rights in metaphysical terms.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely right about that. And as we talk to people on these issues and they want to invoke rights, that can be an entree to them to in our conversation to talk about, where do you get these notions of rights? It's, Holland talks about what an odd, weird thing it is to come up with the idea of human rights. And so, let's, part of the thing that Christians have to do is to be really well informed so that we're ready to give an answer for the hope that we have. And Andrew, thanks for being on with us today. I want to encourage our listeners to go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and you can enter to win a copy of this really wonderful book that Andrew has edited, Social Conservatism for the Common Good, a Protestant Engagement with Robert P. George. And it is excellent. I'm almost done with it. I've been enjoying it in the evenings. And I second everything that Andrew has said about Robert George and what a treasure he is and should be for Protestants in the way that he knows how to engage both effectively and with a sense of Christian humility as well. And may we do the same also. So please visit our website for that. If you're inclined, you can make a donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals so that they can continue to produce some good content for you. And until next time, we'll look forward to being with you again on Mortification of Spin.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.